The Pareto Principle. This is one of the simplest, yet one of the most powerful management ideas of the last century. The Pareto Principle can help us analyze and understand several things that we face on a day-to-day life, whether it is planning or decision making in business, in work, or in life. The Pareto Principle can help. My name is Pradeep. I'm a founder of Tiger Analytics, and today I'm here to talk about Pareto Analytics. So where do we start? Let's begin with the man who started it all. This gentleman with a nice beard, he is Wilfredo Pareto. He was an economist, engineer, sociologist, philosopher. He was a professor. Talking of economics, if you think of economics, how it has changed over time. At one time, economics was a very theoretical subject, right? So think of the Marxian times, driven primarily by moral philosophy and that kind of practices, to what economics is now, very heavily data-driven, very mathematical in nature. Pareto was one of those pioneers that who belonged to that era, which helped economics transition from more of a philosophical practice to more of a quantitative practice that it is today. Now, one of his key interests was studying the mathematics of the socio-economic underpinnings of the society and all. He was fascinated by trends and stats of how society worked, etc. Some of his key works, and what he was really interested was in power and wealth, not to acquire power and wealth, but how is it distributed in the society, right? How do people get it? How do people use it? Right? So to answer these questions, he went about, what did he do? He collected data, right? He collected tax records, rental income records, land records, any income data that he could lay his hand on. He collected this data from Germany, England, France, and a few other countries, right? And over time, over centuries, and he started crunching the data, right? So what he wanted to figure out was, how is wealth distributed in society? Right? And I'll tell you what he found. But today, if I were to ask someone, saying, hey, how do you think wealth is distributed in the society? And let's say this is someone who is just approaching it from a purely, assuming that wealth is a random variable, and most things in nature, which are random, follow a normal distribution. So, hey, my first guess would be probably follows a normal distribution, right? But you think about it a little bit more, then we say, no, wealth doesn't follow a normal distribution, because normal distribution means there's a few rich, few poor, and bulk of it is in the middle. We know this is not how it works in the society. Right? Wealth is, we've always talked about the wealth, the social pyramids and the wealth pyramids, right? There are few people in the top, and there is a large base at the bottom of the spectrum, and the pyramid, there's a gentle slope there, right? This is a linear distribution, right? Now, Pareto went in to the analysis, assuming it might be, he knew it was not a normal distribution, assuming it might be more of a linear thing, and then he plotted the distribution of wealth, right? And what he discovered shocked him. It was neither of these, but it was something like this, right? It was a long tail. There were very few people on the far right, the rich, or the rich were richer than they thought. And the bottom of the curve, bottom of the graph was very thick, meaning there were significantly more people at the lower end of the spectrum, right? So this disillusioned him a bit, and later on he would go on to say, hey, this seems to be human nature, that wherever man interferes, these kind of distributions come up, etc. But later on, over the course of the next century, economists would start seeing this pattern in several socioeconomic scenarios, right? And then, in honor of the man, what they did was they named this the Pareto distribution. In fact, mathematically, this the Pareto distribution is a special form of the power law that we see in other areas of science. Right? So now coming back to what Pareto observed, right? When he did the number crunching, what he saw was this. He saw that 20% of the people owned 80% of the wealth in England. Then he said, hey, maybe in other countries that's not the case. So he started analyzing data for other countries. Right? And he saw the pattern, the same pattern held. Then he said, is it an artifact of this time that I live in, the turn of the 19th century, right? So he went back in time, the 17th century, 16th century, and so on, and the distribution did not change much. So he thought maybe this is something inherent to how this whole thing works. In fact, if you are wondering what it is today, I pull up the latest records from the UN, and today 1% of the people in the world own 50% of the wealth, and 10% about 85% of the wealth. Right? So while we can have the talk about distribution of wealth, pause here a bit. But then there were engineers and management consultants and linguists and a variety of professionals who started seeing this kind of a pattern, right? This kind of a disproportionate influence kind of a pattern in various areas, right, over the course of the last century. Right? And this phenomena came to be known as the Pareto Principle. Right? So it's a very powerful tool. It has found applications in so many different areas because it can help us prioritize our pursuits. Right? What are our pursuits? Our pursuits have two things. Right? There's a cause, there's an effect. There's an input, there's an output. Right? And the Pareto Principle, what it does is, it's trying to tie in these two. And it puts a theory tying in these two, saying that, hey, in most cases, about 20% of your causes will be driving 80% of your effect. Right? About 20% of your inputs will be generating 80% of your outputs. Now, the 20-80, take it in the spirit, right? It need not always be 20-80. It could be 30-70, or in today's digital world, sometimes we see 190, 195 kind of a scenario as well. But in spirit, what the Pareto Principle is telling is that, look, there are several useful causes, several useful inputs, but there are only a vital few. And that could be a way for us to prioritize things. Right? As Tiger Analytics, we work with different businesses in different industries, functions, solving a variety of problems. And we see this popping up over and over again. Right? So, for example, we work with one of the wine retailers and see 20% of their stores generate 60% of the revenue. Right? For a railway company, 80% of their trips come on 30% of their routes. We're working with a large beverage company, 95% of their sales come from 10% of the flavors. Right? So this disproportionate effect seems to occur in a wide range of areas. Right? And we'll look at a slightly different perspective now. Right? So models are bread and butter for most of us. You think about any model, any modeling exercise you would have gone through, right? Whether it is some sort of a demand forecasting or some sort of risk modeling, some propensity modeling, whatever it might be. You usually start off with all the variables, all your independent variables are ones you think, hey, they might have an impact on my output variable. And then you see that usually there's only a few variables on the top, right? Probably the 10-20% of your independent variables. which will explain a vast majority of the variance in the output variable. Right? So this pattern holds, in fact, we are the people who are showing the world that in a variety of cases, this pattern still is holding today as well. So the Pareto Principle in general has been used by businesses over the last few decades to answer strategic questions. But what data science is doing now is it's taking this to the next level, right? So I'll talk a little bit from the perspective of the business today, and then I'll talk from the perspective of a data scientist. Right? So I'll give some examples of how the whole the Pareto analytics is being supercharged by data science. Right? So let's talk about what I call some macro Paretos. Right? So macro Paretos these are high-level questions which help set a very strategic direction. Right? So till date, macro Paretos were usually retrospective in nature. Right? So when I say, hey, 20% of my stores account for 80% of my revenue, it means I know what data exists and I've analyzed that data and I found this pattern, which is still very useful for me because now I can focus my efforts accordingly, whether on stores which are doing well or not on stores which are not doing well. But this is very retrospective looking. But executives today in business know that there are some macro Paretos which are not visible to me, which are complex to find, which are hidden in this web of information. And these might be occurring in the future. And how do I unearth them? Right? So you would have come across situations like this where data science can help these kind of macro Paretos in a predictive sense. I'll talk about, I'll just give you a couple of examples of how complex things can get, a couple of real-life examples. We're working with the CTO's office of a Fortune 100 tech company, right? And the discussion went like this, saying, hey, they told us, hey, we know that there are millions or hundreds of thousands or even millions of open source projects, applications being experimented with existing open source technologies and new. We know a lot of them might be trivial, but a good chunk of them, there's a serious effort going on. And a lot of them will die, some will continue, some will plateau after some time and fade off. But there'll be a handful of those which will make it big 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the line, right? They will be the stars of the open source world in the future. Now, can data science help us identify this? In essence, what is this is, there are these technology executives who are thinking of these macro Paretos in the future and trying to see how can data science help unearth these kind of things. It's a very interesting problem. Now would be too short a time to talk about the solution approach, but you can catch me anytime later during the day. Similarly, another example, right? This was a large food and beverage company, and the discussion went along the lines of there are hundreds of new products being launched today, right? Different positionings, GMO-free, organic, gluten-free, whatnot, and different kinds of flavors. I don't know, like green tea flavor or gooseberry, whatnot, and all new products coming in. And we know we have a part to play. We can benefit, and we want to launch a few products. But we also know that we don't want to launch all the products. There are probably that handful, maybe that 5 to 10 of those that would give us the maximum impact, right? So what are they? Again, someone trying to predict a macro Pareto which is going to occur in the future. Now, let's get to the next level, right? From macro Paretos, we go to micro Paretos, saying from a strategic level, for you to execute something, there needs to be a plan and a very detailed guidelines as to how will the rubber meet the road, right? So think of it, if you think of a marketing problem where a strategy question could be, how do I allocate my marketing budget? right, across various media channels, various channels I have. How much should I spend for TV, for digital, print, and whatnot? A standard strategic question that CMOs ask. There are data sciences helping address these at a macro level, but then things today have gone much beyond this, saying we can also, data science is also able to help answer questions at the next level, saying, yeah, I know I'm going to spend this much on TV. What category of channels do I spend my money on? How much on, say, news versus sports versus entertainment and so on? Take one step down further, right? If it were to be in entertainment channels, which specific channels do I, how do I allocate my budget for these? Doesn't stop there, goes one level below, which is in this channel, how should my ad schedules look like? Saying, what are the programs where I would like to buy ad spots for? And data science is helping today address all the way from a strategic question all the way down to what we call, these are the micro Paretos. The third example I wanted to talk about was, both examples we talked about were a bit more static in nature. There are several scenarios today which are very dynamic in nature, right? So these propensities that we were talking about are not stable. They keep changing over time. Sometimes they change over a few months, sometimes over a few weeks, sometimes over a few minutes. Right? Classic example being online advertising. Right? So this is an example of a very extreme distribution. Right? So we're working with a major credit card company, and then on the campaign optimization. And one of the things that they were seeing was less than 1% of the people who clicked an ad would actually go on to sign up, go to the website, sign up, and eventually become a customer. Right? You see the extreme distribution, and the question there was, how can we identify more of this slice of people so that we get more customers, right? And you think of all the decisions, all the propensities that exist. You're talking about different types of audience. You're talking about when do I reach them? How do I reach them? What kind of offers I can give them? How do I message? What kind of product do I position, etc. All of these are various propensities associated with them going from viewing an ad to actually clicking, applying, and being accepted. Right? And these propensities are changing rapidly, changing depending on what kind of competition is bidding for ads online. These things keep changing, right? And data science, think of if it's a traditional ad operations team and you've thrown this data in front of them, they would just drown in it, right? Now, machine learning is making it possible to make sense of all this data in real time, to actually use all of this and optimize to a very, very fine degree. Right? A brief snapshot of how how data science is helping us achieve Paretos in different, very, very new avenues, right? So we talked about how a Pareto perspective was helping business. We talked about how data science is opening up new avenues here. Now, if you take a step back and saying all this is well, as a data scientist, how can a Pareto perspective help me? Right? All this way, it's been that way. How can it help me? Right? And as data scientists, we come in all different shapes, sizes, and flavors. Some of us are more closer to the business. Some of us are more closer to in the middle. Some of us are more closer to deployment, development, whatnot. All this. So I thought, let me cover a few areas and see how a Pareto perspective can help all of us. Right? So I mentioned a few things, starting with project selection. Right? So if you are in charge of an analytics team, or if you are a stakeholder who has at his or her disposal the services of an analytics team, you're thinking about what will be the analytics use cases that I want to work on. Right? So, and you speak to your colleagues, there are different types of requests coming in, and soon there is a flood of it. Right? So where do you start? Starting randomly is not the answer, or first come, first serve is also not the answer usually. A simple thing that you can do is, if you list all the use cases and put a value to it, saying, hey, if I were to successfully solve this problem, what would be the value I would get out of it? Right? And you sort all these use cases in a decreasing order of value, you would notice that the top few things will be tremendously more valuable than probably the bottom half of your list. Right? So this gives you a simple way to say, hey, where should I start? Right? What is my starting point? While this is a very simple way to doing things, but it's very powerful. Right? So we were recently doing a strategy, analytics strategy, roadmap planning exercise for a Fortune 100 CPG client. And the first job was coming up with the roadmap for the next 2 years. Right? So what we did was something very similar, right? Having all these meetings and then coming up with this list, but then not just do the value, but bring in one more dimension, right? Bring in the dimension of complexity. If you're able to plot your use cases on a simple matrix like this, right? Value versus complexity, this gives you all the information that you need to say, hey, where can I start? Which might be too complex? What are the low-hanging fruit? What are the what are the low-value things that probably I should push off for a later date and so on. So what is this? This is in some ways Pareto analytics conditional on complexity, right? So a couple of simple ways on how you can prioritize projects. Next step, usually you've selected a project. Now the question usually hits you, the project, it's big enough. Do I go about solving the whole problem, or can I scope it better, right? So is there only part of the problem that I can solve and still deliver all the impact or a majority of the impact that I wanted to deliver? Right? Another simple way you can start off is look at what are your effects, your outcomes, your KPIs, whatever you call it. What are the effects in your analysis, in your problem setting, right? It could be revenue, sales, usage, traffic, customer complaints, whatever, right? And on the other side, there are these causes, there are these input dimensions, right? It could be your customers, it could be your product lines, SKUs, your channels, stores, whatnot. If you look at the distribution of the effects on the causes, you'll start seeing some Paretos. Right? You'll start seeing those 30% of your customers who give you 90% of your revenue. That gives you an option to say, hey, can I use this data point as a way to scope my problem better? Can I cut off parts of the problem which might not be really impactful even if I solve them? Right? So a simple way. Extending the logic, you are also thinking about project risks that might come up. All risks are not equal. Don't worry about solving everything before you get started. There'll be those top 2-3 risks which are big ticket ones, and to focus on them and not just get bogged down by everything. Same thing about corner cases. Same thing about all your negotiations with your business stakeholders as data scientists, right? Requests keep coming in, hey, I need this. You know what is feasible, what is not feasible. And there are always, you can use a Pareto lens to say, hey, how do I negotiate? How do I trade off between what I would like to do because I know what will deliver value versus what I can give in and say, hey, probably not needed. So once you've scoped the problem, now comes to data. Again, a very, very, if you are in a situation where you are being handed a data and saying, hey, use this data, this is all you need to do your analysis, consider yourself lucky. Because in today's world, the data part is getting more and more complex. Right? You have certain data that you get from your business stakeholder and in your organization. Now, you know that there is other data out there that will be helpful. Right? It might be publicly available data that you scrape off the internet. It might be data which is being collected by third-party vendors who might supply the data to you. There might be some unstructured data sitting somewhere in some silo, which you know that, hey, some processing effort is needed, but that might have some useful signals, and so on. With each data, there are certain things like there might be some cost elements associated. There might be a cost could come in the form of either dollars or in terms of time taken to access the data, etc. Considering all of this, one approach you can take is, hey, I need all my data before I get started. And we rarely do that because we know that if we do that, the project will never get started. Right? So a simple framework could be divide it into 3 parts, right? Your data. What is my absolute must-have given all the constraints that I laid out? What is good to have and what is purely optional? Get started once you've gotten your absolute must-to-have and push for the good to have so that you can improve. And the purely optional is purely optional. It's a bonus if you get it, right? Coming to analysis and modeling. We usually start with data discovery or an exploratory data analysis on any of our projects. And if you think about all the work that you have done, there will be some of these analysis frameworks or algorithms that you have in your toolkit that you keep using over and over again, right? And a vast majority of those and a vast majority of others you'll only use rarely. So your analysis, your discovery part is typically consists of a bulk of it is standard things that you typically do. They are standard for your style, and there are some which are custom, right? So most of the time you keep using these over and over again. So can you think of accelerating this part of the journey, right? Can you think of, can I automate parts of this? Can I stitch together code modules which are helping me do this? Can I set up systems so that I can access these modules very quickly so that at almost like close to click of a button, I'm able to do a lot of my standard analysis, which leaves me good enough time for my custom analysis. Right? So same thing holds for models as well. All of us have our favorite models, how we get started with, and then only if things don't work, we might go tinker with some other special forms. Right? So coming to model building phase, this is something which, again, a lot of us encounter. If you've allocated 5 to 6 weeks for modeling, you'll see that you have a working model in about a week or 2. And the rest of the time you spend on fine-tuning the model, right? How do I get up my accuracy 1 notch further? My precision, how do I make that a little bit more better, etc. So that initial part, that initial 20% of the time is where your model, the maximum amount of gains in your model have been realized, and the subsequent part is about fine-tuning it, right? Now, well, in some cases, the fine-tuning is what might make or break your project. Maybe you started the project only because it will be effective if you reach a certain threshold. But there will be enough cases where you need not have done that fine-tuning, where very early on in the process, you've gotten insights from your modeling that are good enough for business to take decisions, right? So if you start viewing your modeling with this perspective, you can make a call saying, where do I stop? Right? Where have I realized enough value that I can stop now, and the rest of the time I can focus on, hey, I have already my list of, my Pareto list, which tells me what are the other important things, and start working on that, right? So that's one approach to modeling. Finally, we are not working in silos. We are not building models just for the sake of building models. Analysis has to see light at the end of the day. We are collaborating with a lot of other people in the business. We have our stakeholders who we work with. And the key to getting our work adopted is communication. Right? So you have an option to say, I can communicate all the analysis that I did, all the challenges that I faced, all the models that I built, and all the insights that I got. That's one approach, but you know they're going to drown in a flood of information. So a simple way could be keep it, cut down the content. You know there are few points or few takeaways from all your analysis that give majority of the insight. So you can keep your communication to those key points, right? That vital few that have the maximum impact. So you can, that could be a way to approach all of your business communication. Now, talking about communication, this has been one of the communication exercises for me. And most of us will, in an hour from now, you'll forget 50% of what I said. And probably by end of the day, 75% will be forgotten, right? If not more. So if there is one key takeaway that I would like you to have from this conversation, it is that the Pareto Principle is a very powerful technique in our arsenal, much underutilized in today's world of big data, data science, where we are flooded with information, and because we have tools in our arsenal, we go about ruthlessly slaying the data, right? But it is a very powerful tool in our arsenal, and it can help us optimize, declutter, and prioritize decisions, whether at work or life in general. No? So let's use it. Thank you.